Very serious.
Breaking news now coming to you live from Creekside Early Childhood School. This edition just in. It is in addition to our morning announcement
Yes.
because you guys,
Yes.
we forgot something today.
That was so important.
So important.
It's because you weren't there, Mrs. Russell. We were all thrown off.
You would have reminded us.
I sure would have.
And friends, you saw how discombobulated we were with the Creekside motto and trying to finish up our announcements this morning. So
We are so proud of our Cub leaders from April, and we have our celebration this afternoon.
we do.
Just like our other Cub leaders this year, we want you to hear your name on announcements. So, are you ready?
Mrs.
Yes.
Russell.
Let's celebrate.
All right, kindergarten for Mrs. Benjamin, Adeline H. Miss Fiore, Jeremiah S. Miss Francis, Nia. Mrs. Lerman, Emma M. Mrs. Montgomery, Shaylee. Mrs. Churko, Michelle. Miss Chakvari, Vaughn. Mrs. Stone, Anna. Mrs. Cunningham, Ella. And Mrs. Nab, Owen.
Yay,
First
kindergarten!
grade.
All right, first graders. Hunter in Miss Reininger's class. Anya in Mrs. Todd's class. Skylar in Miss Blackburn's class. Alex in Mrs. Musser's class. Jordan in Miss Winkle's class. Aiden in Mrs. Patterson's class. Avir in Mr. Harold's class. Sophia in Mrs. Sprague's class. Array in Miss Morris's class. Imran in Miss Fisher's class. And Lance in Miss Stein's class.
How about some second grade Cub leaders from Miss Allen's class, Nana. From Mrs. Cavender's class, Luke. Mrs. Waldfogel's class, Cassidy. From Miss Buffler's class, Reet. From Miss Wodes's class, Lewis. From Mrs. Muller's class, Alice. From Miss Eggert's class, Brianna. From,
How did we not?
I just read it. From Mrs. Kellerman's class, Mr. Kellerman. Way to go, Mr. Kellerman. From Mrs. Wilson's class, Jansley, and from Mrs. Fetzer's class, Ocean. Way to go, second grade and above, Cub leaders.
All right. From Mrs.
Our special
Haynes, we'd
edition.
like to nominate Emily Newen for Mrs. Wose's room. Mr. Bodden, Avery Abel for Mrs. Todd's room. Mr. Kellerman, Scarlett and Savannah from Mrs. Winkle and Mrs. Musser.
Wonderful. All right, Mrs. Nino, Henry Troutman from Mrs. Winkle's class. Kennedy, Samia in Mrs. Patterson's class. Mrs. Averbeck, Frankie Kierce in Miss Wodes's class.
And Mrs. Russell nominated Jordan S. for Miss Wilson's class. From Mrs. Adams, Mrs. Kraft, Mrs. Reese, and Mrs. Tierney, Liam G. From Mrs. Dyer, Megan B. And from Mrs. Vonderhaar, Sarah S. And from Mrs. Robinson, Laura C. From Mrs. Sprague's class. One more from Mrs. Harms, Zamina from Miss Allen's class. Hemina. I'm so sorry. Hemina. Sorry. All right. Oh, and by the way, Mrs. Kellerman, if you want to also send a second grader down, you just tell them and send them on down. That'd be great. We
Or
love to have
Mr.
them too.
Kellerman
Or
might
get-
pop over from Heritage
Right, he's
to
there
have a
today, isn't
popsicle
he?
and hang out with us.
So what is today? You gave a sneak peek. What do they get to have today?
Popsicles.
Popsicles. So we will
It's a
see you
beautiful day
soon
for
for
popsicles.
popsicles.
We even announced this morning that we're having popsicles.
We
It's
did.
at
We
2:30.
went through all of
We're
that.
not-
Oh.
We just didn't say the names.
Well,
I don't
special
know.
editions are wonderful editions.
This was a wonderful special edition, as you said. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see the Cub leaders at 2:30. We'll see the rest of you on Creekside Morning Announcements tomorrow.
Bye, everybody.